Hi everyone, so welcome back. I am going to cover still section 1 and then it's going to be the last part for section 1. Hopefully I'm able to cover the entire part. So let me just share my screen. So here it is. And I'm going to be, so just before this, I was covering the cognitive service. Or web identity federation with Cognito, and then now I am going to cover IAM in directory services. So I will go full screen in here, and then this is what we will be covering. So once again, I come to the same screen. So you saw we did all those other sections. So now I am going to talk about the IAM in directory services. So in here, I added some users, and those users would want to access the AWS services. What we do, we go through identity access management, and we create users, and then sometimes we put those users into different groups, and then those groups are being assigned different permission levels. So the users can be put into the groups, or they can be standalone. So if, for example, I have 4 different developers and all of them have the same level of permission, so it's better that I create a group and assign some permission to that group and put all those 4 developers into that one group. So that's how it is. So I have IAM user in groups, and there is also something called IAM role, and IAM role is just something. For example, if I put a hat on my head, then I'm going to be able to enter into a room, do something and come out back, remove the hat, and I'm still the old person. I'm not sure how this example might be relevant to you, but basically what it means is that when you have a role, it's a temporary thing that you have. For example, if I'm putting a hat on my head, go inside the room, do something, I come out, I remove the hat, then I don't have that level of permission once again. Or for example, I enter into a building, I get some, I would say an ID card. With that ID card, I can enter and do something for that time period, come out back, hand over the ID card, and now I'm not able to do anything else after that. So that's what an IAM role is. I will have another section to, I would say, describe in details the difference between IAM role, user, and groups. But basically, it's the way that we are able to access different AWS services. Once again, a user is someone that have a username and a password, and then they access those services. And then if a bunch of users have same level of, let's say, permission, then we put them in a group and assign those permission to the group. And again, IAM role is a temporary access to certain services, but IAM user in groups are long-term access to different services. Okay, Jackie, so that was about the IAM user groups and roles. And now I'm going to talk about the AWS Managed Microsoft AD, or the directory services. So AWS Managed Microsoft AD is one type of the directory services. We also have Active Directory Connector, and we also have Simple AD, right? So those are the different directory services. I wanted to do something different this time. So I am actually using ChatGPT for quite some time to learn AWS, and it's really, really helpful. So if I go to the directory services, so what I did was, I think so just going to refresh the page really quickly. But again, about the ChatGPT, it's a really amazing tool. It can help you learn the services in a much nicer and easier way as compared to when you go and search the same stuff in Google, right? So for example, I just gave this prompt or this question into the into AWS. I said, how does AWS manage Microsoft Directory, Sample AD, and AD Connector work with AWS services in on-prem data center? Please give step-by-step details on how the interaction and integration works with a case scenario. It's better to say with a case scenario because they give you an example and it's much easier to understand it, right? So first what they did was they gave me what those 3 services actually are, right? So for example, if I say The Microsoft Active Directory is a fully managed Active Directory service that's hosted on AWS. It's designed to work with AWS services and can be used to manage users and resources within AWS. So it's kind of a directory service that has information about the users, and then we can use that information to authenticate and authorize users to do certain things on AWS console, right? And then the simple ED is also a directory service, but it's a lightweight and low-cost option for small businesses or organization, and then that do not require the full capabilities of Active Directory. And then ED connector then is actually a proxy service that allows you to use your existing on-prem Active Directory infrastructure to authenticate and authorize access to directory services. I'm going to explain that in a bit details in terms of what's the difference between the two, right? So in here, I don't want to go through everything, but then now they're giving me a scenario and they say step by step, what does an a managed directory is, a managed AD or an AD connector, and how that entire thing will work out, right? So if you do the same thing, it will give you proper explanation of how that thing actually worked out. I might come back to this thing again, but let me go back to my screen and see how it works. So now I have the ED connector, I have a simple ED, and I have a managed. At least you have an idea what those services do, right? So now I'm going to do something. Now, the active, the managed Microsoft ED, right? It's a two-way trust, which means is I have my user information, which is login information, both on my ID store, which is on-prem, and also in AWS, right? So for example, if I wanted to have authenticate a user, I have that information on both sides, and I can use that information to do the authentication process, right? And then the next one, okay, so and then that if someone is being, I would say, authenticated, then they're being authorized to use certain services on AWS. And what happens usually is we have roles on AWS Managed Microsoft AD part or on AWS part. And then we have users in group on the on-prem or ID store or directory that's on-prem, right? So what happens is those users are giving certain roles, and then they use those roles to do certain actions in AWS, right? So it's not that we have users in here. So I might be doing a separate video just on the directory services, and there I will be explaining more in details how the user groups and roles are actually, how the user groups and roles are being mapped to each other when they access the AWS services. But for now, I think so it's just a basic, I would say, introduction or description in relation to all those other services in the security section. Okay, so here you go. Once again, we have the Microsoft ED. There is a two-way trust, which means I can authenticate and authorize my users on both sides. And then this is how it looks like. I'm still using Stefan's slides. I hope it's okay. But once again, if you're studying for your SA Pro exam, his slides are really amazing. His course on Udemy is also really helpful. So here you go. We have on-prem ED here, and we have AWS Managed. There is a two-way trust, and we can authenticate users on both sides. Then we have an ED connector, in which case all my user information is on-prem, and I'm using that information to do authentication for my users to access the AWS services. And then the simple ED is actually a standalone directory within AWS in which we can create users, or we can add users information, and then those users can do can be authenticated and authorized to use AWS services, right? So if we read the information in here, is so what they do is they manage users locally and support MFA, establish trust connection with your on-prem AD. I think so I don't need to read this entire part, but basically you can understand the managed directory to the authentication process, both sides, the AD connector all the information is present on the on-prem side, and then we do authentication to use the AWS services. And ED, simple ED is actually a standalone small directory that's used for smaller, is used by smaller businesses or organization. Okay, so that's what we talked about the directory services. So now if I go step by step in here, so what I did was, here's a user, and that user wanted to be to access the AWS services. So they first have to go through ED connector, and the ED connector is going to proxy that request in the ID store or directory that's present on-prem, right? And then once the user is being authenticated, they give a token, and then that token is again taken back to the ED connector, and then the ED connector go through STS. Excuse me. And then STS is again providing the security credential. And then those security credentials are being used to actually access the AWS services. So that's how it works. We have a user. The user through AD connector is going to be authenticated on an on-prem ID store or directory. They're being given some ID token. ID tokens are taken to STS, and then the STS provide temporary credentials. Those temporary credentials are being used to access the AWS services. Okay, so awesome. We did talk about the entry part. In the entry part, we covered IAM, Cognito, Directory Services, and SAML and Web Federation. I haven't talked about the single sign-on, but I'm going to cover that as well right now. Okay, again, so this was about the directory services, which we did cover, right? So if I talk about a little bit more in details how the ED connector works, let's just go by the like this. Again, it's the slide from Stefan. So here's a user. The user is going to go through a custom sign-in page, right? That sign-in page is going to go through the ED connector. The ED connector is going to assume role with STS. No, actually, okay, so here's the user, come through a custom sign-in page, and then that's come to ED connector. The ED connector is going to do authentication from a corporate office or data center directly on the corporate data center or on-prem. And then number 4, they're being given an STS token, and then the STS or temporary credential are being used to come through ED connector, and afterwards they use the directory or they use the AWS services. This slide might be a bit confusing, but if you follow the steps that I mentioned here in blue, that will be, I think, more easier to understand. Awesome. So now coming to AWS SSO, which is single sign-on. So if you read this one single sentence in here, which says SAML 2.0 federation is the old way. Amazon single sign-on or SSO federation is the new managed and simpler way. So it's basically putting that SAML federation in a much more easier, convenient, and simple way is the SSO. So now SSO is also giving you access to, I would say, other business applications such as Office 365, Dropbox, Slack, also to custom SAML applications, also services on AWS, and also the on-prem directory services. So now you have one place or one portal in which you have one user login information, and then now you access a bunch of different services, which not only include the AWS services or on-prem AD, it also has other business applications such as Dropbox and Slack, and some other custom SAML applications. So that's what SSO is. And again, so my apologies, I had to stop my recording. I'm actually in the library, and then they had an announcement, and I think so there was someone knocking as well, so I had to stop that. Okay, but here you go. Let me just resume back. So we talk about the SSO part, right? Or the single sign-on, right? So next, here is again slide from Stefan. I'm really hoping he is okay that I'm using quite a few of his slides. But here you go. So here's the AWS single sign-on, right? So what happens? So there is actually a client, and they sign in through SSO. And there is actually an identity store, and then that identity store is actually providing temporary credential, and then they use the AWS services. But if you go with assume role with SAML, then what we have is some extra steps. So the users go through the identity portal, and then they're being authenticated, and they take that token, they go through the SDS, and SDS gives temporary credential, and those credentials are being used to access the AWS services, right? So what happens is we are removing some steps, which is the SDS token, or that still might be working in the background, but me as a client is only seeing one portal that I log in through it, and then I'm being directed towards my AWS console where I'm able to use the AWS services. So this is how the SSO actually simplifies that entire process. So this is again a slide with AWS Microsoft Managed ED integration, right? So we have the SSO through SAML. We can access all those other services. We have extended on-prem AD, and then we have some traditional applications. And this is how we can do authentication and authorization using AWS Managed AD. I won't go into details, where it might be a bit confusing to have so much stuff on the slide, but what happens, I wanted to keep things really simple. If you follow the steps that I actually covered, I would say in here, it will be much more clear. But again, if you wanted to learn in details each separate service, I will be doing more videos on each service separately. And there you can go into more details, but definitely you can also find more amazing, I would say, learning materials on YouTube or elsewhere to continue your studying, right? So I think so we covered pretty much everything in the entry part. So which consisted again of the SAML federation, web federation, with Cognito, without Cognito, the IAM users roles, and also the directory services. So I would say thank you for this section. I am going to do more videos on the remaining sections, which now includes of the detection and monitoring part, and that is actually of CloudWatch, CloudTrail, and rest of it. So, and then I have 2 more sections for the security part, and after which I'm going to wrap it up. So once again, thank you so much, and I am going to be seeing you in the next section. Have a good day, or a good night, or a good evening. Bye for now.